we actually have a new shot at this. And I want to give the administration credit, because this time around, there's already been 2 meetings and a 3rd meeting is scheduled. That makes it a world record. It's never happened before. And there is an understandable political reality as to why there is an interest on both sides to keep a political process, a diplomatic process alive. And that is, if you're the sitting president of the United States, you need to make sure that oil prices go down. Because when oil prices go up, gas prices go up. When gas prices go up, job creation comes down. Secondly, if you have an ongoing diplomatic process, it is believed to be the biggest obstacle for a unilateral Israeli attack, which the US military and the administration completely opposes. The political cost for unilateral action is deemed to be too high if there is an ongoing negotiation. The problem is, though, that even though the desire or the political need for talks are probably the greatest they've been in a long time, flexibility is at its minimum as a result of the upcoming elections. Both things connected to the elections. And the problem has been that the administration is going to the negotiations, I think, recognizing that they really can't get anything unless they're willing to give something. But they're so afraid that they will be so attacked if they give something to the Iranians. And what the Iranians obviously are looking for is some form of sanctions relief or delay. In return, we've made it very clear what we want, but in Baghdad, we were not willing to offer anything that the Iranians deemed to be of equal value. And I think most objective observers would recognize that we really didn't offer anything in particular. The idea that the Iranians would give up 20%, send out a lot of their stockpile, and that we would still have new sanctions go into effect on July 1st just sounds a bit unrealistic. We kind of went into a store and we said, we want this, we want that, and we want this, but we're not willing to pay for it. And that's not going to work. Now, an optimistic read of the whole situation is that perhaps we did a calculated failure in Baghdad, the talks that were held just 2 weeks ago, because we knew that there was enough time for another meeting before the oil sanctions would come into effect July 1st. So we would have one more shot to being able to try to get the Iranians to give up as much as possible before we play that card. I would believe that optimistic belief if I wasn't living in Washington. But living in Washington and seeing what the political landscape is, and when I talk about the political landscape, that's not just Washington, of course, it's all of you. To the extent that groups such as you are vocal in creating political space for the administration to be able to go and effectively negotiate. We can't send off negotiators empty-handed into a negotiation. That's just not possible. And have them have the readiness to be able to give something in order to get something very, very valuable. And what is fascinating that in Baghdad, the Iranians had made it clear some of the things that the US is very interested in getting from Iran, Iran had made clear it's negotiable, meaning they're willing to offer it if the price is right. We were not willing to offer a price. Forget about the price being right. There was no real offer there on the table. And I think it is largely because of the political constraints at home. If that doesn't change by the time we reach Moscow on June 18th, and we fail at this, we can't offer anything because we're too afraid of the consequences politically at home in the election year, then I think this may have been our last chance. Because then we're going to see real oil sanctions, oil embargo, and central bank sanctions go in effect on Iran. And we know from the past what happens when we escalate. When we escalate, the Iranians escalate. And part of the reason why they have such a more advanced nuclear program right now is because we have primarily pursued a pressure track. What is the way for the Iranians to pressure the US back? It's by doing exactly the kind of things that we find most objectionable. And at that moment, it's going to be very difficult to see. What is the assessment of the markets? Are the Israelis going to take action? Is there any comfort or anything left to make sure that there could be another attempt at diplomacy after the elections? The best outcome, in my prediction, would be that the Europeans agree to delay their oil embargo for another 6 months. In return, the Iranians would freeze 20% for 6 months, an equal amount of time. And then after the elections, all sides could come together and perhaps there could be a more proper negotiation. The question is, even if it's not an American sanction that is being lifted, because these are European oil embargoes, can the administration, do they feel that they can afford it? In my assessment, and I don't have the same data as the administration does on where the American public stands on this, but in my assessment, I don't think anyone in the American public would have any problem with it.
Amen.
Let's remember what stopping 20% means. Stopping 20% means that we eliminate Iran's shortcut for a nuclear weapon. That's a highly valuable gain. To lift some of the oil embargo that has actually contributed to the financial crisis in Europe is also a gain. And avoiding a war as a result of this is also a gain. The problem is that much of this conversation is being kept at such a high level, it's not accessible to the public. So the public has no idea of what is going on, what they can do about it, and put the type of correct pressure on their decision makers not to stand in the way. Because the main problem in the US right now is the US Congress. If I was the president, I would not expect that Congress is going to be helpful. But nor would I expect being held hostage by Congress. I think there's been a psychological dimension to the way that we have approached negotiations that have essentially been apologetic. Even in some of the justifications for trying diplomacy that was spelled out, before we even tried, the argument was, well, if we pursue diplomacy, well, if it doesn't work, at least it will enable us to get even tougher sanctions on Iran. It's kind of like saying, I like drinking wine, not for the taste of it, but because I love the hangover. We're not willing to sell the activity for its own value, but for an irrelevant side effect. That's what we're putting forward. I think the kind of political backbone that is needed to successfully deal with Congress is to do essentially what Yitzhak Rabin did in Israel when he wanted to pursue peace negotiations with the Palestinians, and he was faced with a tremendous backlash from some of the forces in Israel. And what did he say? He said, I make peace with my enemies, not with my friends. Completely unapologetic, sticking very firm. Of course, he paid the highest price for that courage as well. But it's that level of political courage that is needed both in Tehran and in Washington to succeed, particularly when you're dealing with institutions like Congress that right now in particular seem to have made, at least half of them have made a decision that they're going to try to make Obama fail regardless of what Obama tries to do. I think the dynamics in the Security Council internationally is going to be very interesting. On the one hand, you have now a new president in France who may not have a particularly different view on the Iran dossier than Sarkozy had. We don't really know yet. But he certainly doesn't seem to have the same type of a ADHD type of mentality when it comes to really pressing the rest of Europe in going along with the oil embargo. He was the decisive force for that. In the middle of the financial crisis in Europe, Sarkozy manages to push the rest of Europe to go along with an oil embargo. That's quite an achievement, one has to say. Hollande doesn't seem to have the same type of stake or interest in that issue. So it's going to be interesting to see. We haven't seen any difference yet because the French negotiators have not been changed yet. The teams have not been changed yet. So in Baghdad, the French kind of behaved as if Sarkozy was still in power. The other thing that is fascinating is that the administration, I believe correctly, has emphasized the importance of having international unity in order to get any progress on this issue. But international unity became essentially a nicer way of saying everyone has to agree to our sanctions. That's how we kept unity. But now, I think the other side is going to make that argument, that for the sake of unity, there needs to be flexibility from the United States and from the West. Because in Baghdad, or actually prior to Baghdad, the Russians actually threatened to put forward their own proposal on the table. That is a warning to the United States, saying, if you're not willing to be more flexible, we're going to put forward a proposal. The Iranians may accept our proposal. What are you going to do then? So there's a lot of anxiety and, frankly, frustration in some of the other P5. They all agree unity is critical. No one wants to start having the P5 states go in different directions. But the lowest common denominator is the almost non-existent political space in Washington. And that's very difficult for others to accept, that they have to negotiate from that departure point. And all make exceptions for the peculiarities of the American political season, rather than on what actually is needed to get a nuclear breakthrough. So we're going to see some very interesting developments in the next 3 weeks. And I think the fact that it's held in Moscow is going to increase the Russian eagerness. They want to make sure that it's a success, that they have the success is credited to them to a certain extent because they're the host of it, etc. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on all sides. And that pressure may be needed. As it comes to the larger issue of normalization, I think it's so far down the road. There are no constituencies, seriously, for that. And I don't think there actually are necessarily in Iran either. I'm not so convinced that ultimately what the Iranian hardliners are looking for is some sort of a partnership with the United States. Normalized relations in the sense of having diplomatic relations, perhaps, yes, but I don't think the Iranians are looking for a partnership with the US, and I don't think the Obama administration or the next administration would look for a partnership with the Islamic Republic of Iran. I don't think that's the name of the game at this stage. The name of the game is to reach a plateau of stability so that we can get out of this 10-year-long constant threat that war is around the corner. Thank you so much.